May 16, 1916. London and Paris. Two mid-level diplomats, a British baronet named Mark Sykes and a French consul named François-Georges Picot, sat down with a map of the Middle East and a chinograph pencil and drew lines. Not careful, considered lines that reflected the language people spoke, the tribes that had shared land for centuries, the religious communities that had developed their own ways of governing themselves over 1,000 years. Just lines, straight lines mostly, the kind of lines that are easy to draw on a map when the people living under them are not in the room. The Sykes-Picot Agreement carved the Arab territories of the dying Ottoman Empire into British and French spheres of influence. It created the framework for the borders of Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, Jordan, and Palestine. It was signed in secret, without consulting a single Arab leader who had been promised independence in exchange for fighting against the Ottomans. When the Bolsheviks published it in 1917, Arab nationalists were enraged. They have been living with the consequences ever since. But what if those lines were never drawn? What if the Ottoman Empire had not collapsed? Georgetown University historian Mustafa Aksakal, in his book on the war that made the Middle East, argued something that challenges the conventional wisdom about Ottoman decline. He contended that on the eve of the Great War, the Ottoman Empire was not in fact the terminally ill, sick man of Europe that European powers assumed it to be. It was a viable political entity, still reforming, still modernizing, still capable of governing its vast territories. What destroyed it was not inevitable decay. What destroyed it was catastrophic decisions, specifically the decision by a small group of officers in the ruling Committee of Union and Progress to enter the First World War on Germany's side in late 1914. That decision was not inevitable. There was a serious faction within the Ottoman government that wanted to stay neutral. Had they prevailed, the Ottomans stay out of the war. The British and French, fighting Germany without an Ottoman front to worry about, have fewer reasons to make promises to Arab nationalists. The Sykes-Picot Agreement is never written. The Balfour Declaration, the 1917 British letter promising a Jewish homeland in Palestine, issued partly to win Jewish support in Russia and America during the war, has no context to be issued in. The entire architecture of promises, betrayals, and artificial borders that the British and French built out of Ottoman collapse simply does not exist. The map of the Middle East today is the direct product of those lines Sykes and Picot drew in 1916. As NPR correspondents noted when examining the agreement's legacy, there are essentially 5 artificial nations that were created by it, the most prominent being Iraq and Syria. Anyone looking at those countries today sees that the artificial borders have completely disintegrated. ISIS, when it captured Mosul in 2014 and erased the border between Iraq and Syria, made its conquest explicitly an anti-Sykes-Picot statement. Its propaganda framed the group's territory as the restoration of a unified Islamic state that Western powers had dismembered. The slogan, "The End of Sykes-Picot," resonated across the Arab world not because most Arabs supported ISIS, but because the artificiality of the region's borders is, as one analyst put it, universally acknowledged. Iraq was created by stitching together Shia Arabs in the south, Sunni Arabs in the center, and Kurds in the north, 3 communities with entirely different histories, languages, and political ambitions, under a centralized state that none of them had chosen and that none of them particularly wanted. As T.E. Lawrence, the British officer who advised Arab leaders during the war, noted with grim cynicism, the region's divisions would ensure a tissue of small, jealous principalities incapable of cohesion. He was describing what British policy was deliberately creating. The Kurdish people, roughly 40 million of them, were split among Turkey, Iraq, Syria, and Iran, denied a unified homeland, and have been fighting for one ever since. The Palestinian question, which emerged directly from the collision of British promises to both Arab nationalists and Zionist leaders about the same piece of land, has produced wars in 1948, 1967, 1973, 1982, 2006, 2008, 2012, 2014, 2021, and 2023. The Syrian Civil War, which began in 2011 and has killed over 500,000 people while displacing over 12 million, is in part a story about the failure of an artificial state built around a colonial border that lumped together communities that had never previously been governed as a single unit. An Ottoman Empire that survives does not solve all of this. It creates its own problems, its own injustices, its own nationalist tensions. The empire was not a democracy. Its record on minority rights was deeply troubled. The Armenian genocide, carried out during the war years, represents one of the worst atrocities of the early 20th century. Historians have debated whether a more stable, non-wartime Ottoman government would have produced the same outcome. What is not debatable is that the collapse of the empire and the way it collapsed produced a specific set of catastrophes that a surviving empire would have avoided. An Ottoman Middle East in the 21st century would almost certainly be a federal or confederal state, something more like the Austro-Hungarian Empire attempted in its last decades, or what the European Union represents today, than the rigid nation-states the British and French imposed. Ottoman governance for centuries operated through a millet system, a form of recognized communal autonomy in which different religious and ethnic communities managed their own internal affairs under an overarching imperial framework. It was not equality, but it was a system that allowed Jews, Christians, and Muslims to live in the same cities for generations without the explosive conflicts that drawing hard national borders around homogeneous states produced. In a world where the Ottoman Empire survives and modernizes as Japan modernized after the Meiji Restoration, as Turkey itself did after the Republic was established in 1923, you have a governing framework already in place for one of the most strategically important regions on Earth. The oil that begins flowing from Mesopotamia and Arabia in the early 20th century flows to an Ottoman treasury, rather than to British and French companies operating under colonial concessions. The wealth that built the modern Gulf states the extraordinary concentration of petrodollars in the hands of a few ruling families who used it to export a specific, rigid interpretation of Islam around the world distributes differently if the Ottomans rather than the British are defining who controls the Arabian Peninsula. Wahhabism, the austere expansionist form of Islam that the Saudi religious establishment has spent decades and billions of dollars spreading to mosques and madrasas from Indonesia to Bosnia, would not have had a state patron. One analyst of Ottoman alternate history argued directly that a surviving Ottoman Empire would have crushed or marginalized Wahhabism, which was a fringe desert theology before Saudi oil money gave it global reach. Al-Qaeda's ideology drew explicitly on Wahhabi thought. So did ISIS. In a world without Wahhabism as a state-sponsored global movement, the intellectual infrastructure of the jihadist terrorism that defined the early 21st century simply does not exist in the same form. This does not mean a surviving Ottoman world is peaceful. Empires have wars. Nationalist movements would still have emerged, demanding more autonomy or independence. The tensions between modernity and tradition that convulsed the Middle East throughout the 20th century would still have had to be worked through. Ottoman rule over subject peoples, Armenians, Greeks, Arabs, Kurds, Jews, had its own history of violence and suppression that cannot be erased by a thought experiment. But the specific violence of the modern Middle East, the particular shape of the Palestinian conflict, the particular way Iraq was broken, the particular funding network that built Al-Qaeda and ISIS, the particular failure of states like Syria and Libya to hold together all of that, traces back to a map drawn in London and Paris in 1916 by two men with a pencil who had never lived in the land they were dividing. They drew their lines in 1916. The Middle East is still bleeding from them. If the Ottoman Empire had survived, do you think the Middle East would be more stable today? Drop your answer below.